Let's talk about marriage. Let's talk about the different types of marriage so that you can get at least a bit of understanding what each marriage in South Africa actually means, the implications of the types of marriages. Why is it important to talk about this? Well, the reason why I deem it important to talk about this is because I've met a lot of people who are married, particularly in community or property. And one of the things that I've discovered is that most of them did not understand this kind of marriage that they entered into, nor did they understand the implications of this kind of marriage. And so now, seeing everything and how it pans out and the consequences, they literally would like to reverse and start all over again, but unfortunately they cannot do so. So I want us to create this educative video here so that at least those that are yet to get married get a bit of glimpse of understanding of the different types of marriages or marital regimes in South Africa. So without further ado, let's just start this conversation, right? So let me introduce myself to all of those that are new here. Good afternoon. My name is Mnyengeza, and I'm an attorney and a director at Mnyengeza Attorneys. Let's get into the different types of marriages in South Africa. Now let's talk about the first type of marriage in South Africa. First one is a marriage in community of property. So this one is the default marriage. So if you don't sign any form of contract or don't do anything prior, you just get married. The default marital regime you're going to be in is a marriage in community of property. Now, what does it entail? What does it look like? Let's briefly talk about it. Now, when you enter into a marriage in a community of property, it means that you are binding everything that you have with your spouse. If you had any assets, if you had any debts, any interests, all of that is binded with your current spouse, and you guys become equal owners of the joint estate that is created. So that's just in a nutshell what a marriage in community of property is, right? So what does this mean in practice? It means that if you had an immovable property, even if it's in your name currently, as soon as you get into this kind of marriage, your spouse is also an equal owner of that, of that property, right? If you had a debt or they had debts that they came with, it means that you both now share in those debts. They are equally your responsibility because what you have built is what? Is a joint estate. So both of you share in everything that affects the other spouse. What is the other thing that also pertains to a marriage in community of property? Things like your inheritance, your donation. If, for example, you were to inherit something, particularly if you inherited, without any restrictions, which means that the person who passed away did not draft a will, and exclude the inheritance from your marriage, it means that automatically what you have inherited, your husband or your wife will also be entitled to it because you are what? You are in a marriage in community of property. Even if you inherit a certain share in that property, whatever share you have, you share with your current spouse. So those are the implications of a marriage in community of property. This also applies with regards to donations. If somebody decides to donate 100,000 Rand to you or decides to donate whatever it is to you without any form of restriction, it's going to mean that your spouse is also entitled to that donation. Why? Because you are married in community of property. So these are some of the things that you need to understand is that when you are in a marriage and community of property, this is a partnership. You do away with the I, the mine, it's now ours, everything, that pertains to this marriage. The other thing that also applies to a marriage in community of property, like we said, you join even in the debts that you guys have. Now, let's talk about a particular scenario that a lot of people tend to get shocked by, when it comes to a marriage in community of property. Now, remember, even though you're married in community of property, with some spouses, they take out debt without a care in the world, without being cognizant of the fact that it could also affect you as the other spouse because there's a joint estate here. And what has happened in the past, which we have seen as very problematic for spouses, is that another spouse would take out so much debt to the extent that when they pass away, the other spouse who is remaining would find out that, okay, this person had so much debt, and now this debt not only is affecting them, is now affecting me. And what we have seen is that in some instances, the spouse who is surviving has had to either sell a property or end up coughing money to cover the debt that was taken out by the other spouse, because, the debt is part of the marriage. It's part of the joint estate. So these are things that you just need to understand. And like I said, there's a lot of things that affect this kind of marriage and the implications thereof. This is just a tip on the iceberg. So just make sure before you enter into a marriage, you get proper advice so that you know exactly what you're getting into. But let's move on. Let's talk about the next type of marriage, which is a marriage out of community or property without accrual. Now, marriage out of community or property without accrual, what does it entail? How do you get into it? So first things first, with this type of marriage, before you even enter into a marriage, before you enter into any lobola negotiation or allow people to pay lobola on your head, or even go and pay lobola for your prospective bride, first thing that you're going to do as a couple, you're going to see your lawyer so that you can enter into an antenuptial contract. This contract is the one that's going to ensure that when you're getting married, you are married out of community of property, right? Did you hear what I said? You do it before, not after the marriage, not after, going through lobola negotiations. And there's a reason why, right? So once you've entered into this kind of contract, which we call the antenuptial contract, and is registered at the deeds office, what's going to happen is that you're now going to get married, and once you're married, you're going to be declared married out of community or property. Now, what are the implications of you being in this type of marriage? Now, the implications here are that you're going to be like a single person who is in a marriage. Let me paint this out for you. When you're in a marriage out of community or property with accrual, you maintain your own assets. You don't join in ownership with your spouse. The debts you had are going to be exclusively your debts. Your spouse's debts are going to be exclusively their debts. The interests that they have anywhere else, whether it be a pension interest or whatever the case is going to continue to be theirs solely. Nothing is joined together. Each party controls their assets, each party controls their liabilities, each party controls their interests, right? There is never a confusion or a complication in this regard. It's only when you decide to probably buy something jointly where you'll have that joint responsibility, right? Otherwise, nothing is automatically joined in this type of marriage. And a lot of people love these types of marriages because they want to protect, their future interests. What do I mean by this? For example, some people love pursuing business, right? And in their businesses, sometimes they name themselves as surety. And with business, things can go either way, which means that if they've named themselves as surety, there's a potential of creditors coming for them. And if you're married in community or property, right, when a creditor comes for you, it means they're coming for the joint estate. But now if you're married out of community or property and a creditor comes for you, they come for you on a personal level. They cannot attack your spouse. They cannot take away the things that your spouse has. They are prohibited from doing so because of the law, which means what? Which means that if you're down and out because the creditors have crippled you because of whatever business ventures you had, at least you can rest assured that whatever it is that your spouse has in their name is safe and sound, and you are going to survive in this marriage. So I know a lot of people sometimes look at this in the negative context, but it also has very positive, positive implications. So you just need to speak to your legal practitioner, understand what you want, and then make a choice for yourself. Let's talk about the last type of marital regime, which is a marriage out of community or property with accrual. So the marriage out of community or property with accrual, what does this one entail? What are the consequences of being in this type of marriage? Now, before we continue talking about this aspect, I just want to put it out there as a disclaimer. Please do not take this video as legal advice, right? But rather, it's meant to educate you. It's meant to make you aware of the different types of marital regimes in South Africa, the options that you have, so that you can then take the necessary steps, either by going to your own legal practitioner to get more advice, or else speaking to your prospective partner. But we just want you to get some form of education, right? But this is not legal advice. Be that as it may, we do encourage that if you have found this video useful and you think it's worth sharing to any other person, please do share, like, subscribe, come back as well, right? Because we'd like to share this education with a lot of people, not just the people that are watching here, because other people are not aware of this channel, right? So let's talk about this kind of marriage. What does it entail? Marriage out of community or property with accrual. Now, if you recall, with a marriage out of community or property without accrual, what we said was when people enter into that kind of marriage, what happens is that they still retain all of the things that they have in their personal capacity, their debts, their assets, and all of their interests. They don't join with the other spouse. They don't have shared interest all of a sudden in all of the things that they were building over the years. And this also applies in this type of marriage. When you're entering into a marriage out of community or property with accrual, you still retain ownership of the things that you have. The debts are still yours. Your spouse is not going to be responsible for your debts, and they're not going to share in the interests that you have. But rather, this type of marriage, when people enter into it, what they're saying is they would like to share in the growth that both of them attain during the marriage. What does this mean? So this in essence means that when you're about to enter into this marriage, when we're drafting that anti-nuptial contract of yours, we're going to just measure how much are you worth currently, right? And then we look at your spouse as well. How much is your spouse worth? And thereafter, we will know how much you're worth before entering into the marriage. So which means that when you're exiting, we will see whether your estate has grown individually or that of your spouse, or it has not grown. And whoever has the greatest growth will then share with the other spouse in the growth that they have. Not in whatever it is that they have, but rather in the growth. These spouses or spouses that enter into this kind of marriage, see it necessary or deem it necessary to enter into this marriage because they believe that it's only fair to share in the growth of the things that they have grown in the marriage, because they help each other as spouses, they work with each other. And so they're like, it's only fair to share in whatever growth that we have in this marriage. But obviously, this also has a lot of implications. You really need to understand it in depth. So if you're someone who's considering this type of marriage, it could be very useful for you to sit down with your legal practitioner, because sometimes you might think it's the simplest thing, but it has a lot of implications. And you'll find that a lot of people, when I start talking to them about it, they renege and say, maybe it's not a good idea. So please do speak to your legal practitioner to understand it a bit better. But this is what, in essence, it entails, right? And so what this means is that you've got options available. Depending on what you want, you have options available. Like I said, with a marriage out of community or property without accrual, that spouse, when they lose everything, at least there's another spouse that is a backup for them. At least the other spouse doesn't lose everything that they have, unlike if you are in a marriage in community or property. And another thing just to note about a marriage, out of community or property with accrual is the fact that whatever it is that you have to share, with your spouse, in terms of accrual, only is considered or comes about to be an asset when the marriage comes to an end. Right? So your creditors can't say, we're coming for your spouse because you guys are married out of community or property with accrual. It's not an asset when you are married. It's worth nothing when you're married. It's only worth something when the marriage comes to an end, whether by death or divorce. So this, in essence, is what a marriage out of community or property with accrual actually entails. And like I said, make sure you get proper legal advice to understand also the other implications of this type of marriage. So this brings us to the end of our discussion today, and I hope it was useful to you. So if it was, like we always say, like, share, subscribe, come back so that we can create more content, right? And so that more people can benefit from this content. My name is Yolanda Mnyengeza, and I'm an attorney and a director at Mnyengeza Attorneys. We'll see you next time. Have a good afternoon.